So today's topic is voting and elections. We're looking at this idea that free and fair elections are the cornerstone of the American political system. Free and fair elections, this is the idea. Basically, what a free election is, that means that there's an election where there's no restraints, that basically I can vote for the candidate that I want to vote for. I don't have you looking over my shoulder telling me who I should vote for, right? There's a secret ballot. So I am free to express myself in terms of the way I want to vote. When we talk about fair elections, it means that there are generally accepted and generally followed rules. Now we're going to see that that's not always been the case, but it certainly is the ideal and the goal. Free and fair elections give citizens a way to make changes in the government. Okay, really important. What it does is it gives us an opportunity to select and choose new leaders. Elections are the way that we hold our elected officials accountable, right? We hold them accountable. We elect our politicians, they work for us. If we don't think they're doing a good job, we can elect someone else, right? This is the point of the elections, and this is the way that the system of American democracy works. There are two kinds of elections: primary elections and general elections. These elections are discussed on page 175 in your book. Primary elections generally start in early February and go through June, right? The point of a primary election is for political parties to choose their candidates who will then run in the general election. The general election is held the first Tuesday in November. Now, the point of the general election is to determine who will fill various political positions. We're looking at positions like senators, representatives, president. We're basically focusing on the national government, okay? Now, we began talking about the presidential primaries in our class when we were together. We talked about them in early February through the beginning of March. As you can see from this graphic, basically the Democrats started out with 28 candidates, 28 people who hoped to become the Democratic candidate for president, right? Those are the people in the blue squares. The Republicans had 4 candidates, right? Those are the people who hoped to be the Republican candidate in the general election. So what happened? What you see here is after 2 caucuses and 27 primaries, not all of the states have held their primaries yet, but Donald Trump emerged as the Republican presidential candidate. No surprise there because he's the incumbent, which we'll talk about in a little while. And Joe Biden emerged as the Democratic frontrunner. All of the other Democratic candidates, all 27 of the other ones, dropped out, including Bernie Sanders, who most recently dropped out and then in turn endorsed Joe Biden. Now, 16 states have in fact postponed their primaries, New York State being one of them. They've done this really unprecedented, but they've done it because of the coronavirus, that we're afraid for people to congregate and come together in the large numbers that an election would entail. That works for the primaries because they're controlled by the states. That can't really work for the general election in November. The general election cannot be moved without substantial, serious legislative action. And even if the general election could be moved or postponed, most people believe that should not happen, right? We have always had our regularly scheduled general election. During natural disasters, even during the Civil War, the United States held its general elections, right? These elections are considered to be the way in which we peacefully transfer power, and like I said, they are the cornerstone of American democracy. But the question that I want to look at now is, what about voting? Who actually gets to vote? Who participated in these elections? Now, I know that you guys are doing all sorts of things and school is really going a little crazy, but I'm hoping that you have had a chance to do a little bit of your reading in the textbook. Do me a favor and poke around wherever you are and find something to write with and a piece of paper. And I want you to write numbers 1 through 10 on this piece of paper. We're just this is a quiz that we are not gonna actually grade, obviously, but I just want you to get a sense of if you're keeping up with the reading and understanding the material. So, 10 quick questions. Just write down the answers, no need to write the questions. Question number 1. A person appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court is appointed for a term of blank. So fill in the blank. Question number 2. If a person is indicted for a crime, name 2 rights which he has. Number 3. Cases tried before a court of law are of what 2 types? Civil and blank. Number 4. If no candidate for president receives a majority of the electoral vote, who decides who will become president? Number 5. If no person receives a majority of the electoral vote, the vice president is chosen by the Senate. True or false? Number 6. If an effort to impeach the U.S. president is made, who presides at the trial? Number 7. If the 2 houses of Congress do not agree on adjournment, who sets the time? Number 8. A president elected in November takes office the following year on what date? Number 9. Of the original 13 states, the one with the largest representation in the first Congress was blank. Finally, number 10, the Constitution limits the size of the District of Columbia to blank. Okay, I'm gonna run through the answers, see how you do. Just keep track of the number correct. The answer to number 1 is life. The answer to number 2, rights against compulsory self-incrimination, double jeopardy, excessive bail, cruel and unusual punishment, rights to due process, speedy trial, public trial, and the right to counsel. Okay. Number 3, the answer is criminal. Number 4, the answer is House of Representatives. Number 5, the answer is true. Number 6, the answer is Chief Justice. We just went through all this, right? Number 7, the answer is President. Number 8, the answer is January 20. Number 9, the answer is Pennsylvania. And number 10, the answer is 10 square miles. Now, I'm just wondering, I wish I could have a show of hands, how many people got 10 correct? Did you? 9 correct? Maybe 8? If you had a hard time with this and you were not able to answer every one of these questions successfully, apparently you are not literate. Apparently you are not literate. What you just took is a part of the Alabama State Literacy Test, compiled by the Alabama Supreme Court and used to determine who was eligible to vote in Alabama until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act made the test illegal. The Alabama Literacy Test, used to see whether or not you would be allowed to vote. Now, I just want to raise a couple of questions with you. First is, what does literacy mean? What does literacy mean? Well, it means the ability to read and write. The ability to read and write. If you were able to read those 10 questions and you were able to write answers to those questions, regardless of whether you knew that material and you answered them correctly, you are literate because you are able to read and write, right? It has nothing to do with the content. So this is not actually a literacy test, is it? This test was not judging whether or not somebody could read and write. It was doing something very different. And let me ask you another question. Do you think you actually need to be able to read and write in order to be eligible to vote? Do you need to be able to read and write in order to be eligible to vote? Certainly it helps. Certainly it helps. But is it required? Can't you imagine a situation where a person may in fact not be able to read and write and still would deserve to have their voice heard? So who is eligible to vote in the United States? Very generally, although there are some exceptions, you need to be 18 years old and you need to be a citizen. And if you meet those two criteria, then you are eligible to vote. Now, this was not always the case, obviously, in the United States. Initially, white men were eligible to vote. White men. And so many of us did not have that privilege, and it is indeed a privilege. All right, so initially it was white men, some of whom had to be property owners, were the only people that were eligible to vote. But this changed, and actually we see an expansion of the franchise, the suffrage, the right to vote, right? And what we see is significantly 3 constitutional amendments. The first in 1870 is the 15th Amendment, comes right after the Civil War, that gives the right to vote to black men. It basically says that the vote cannot be denied on the basis of color or race. So black men are eligible to vote after 1870, so says the Constitution. It took 50 years of struggle, but 50 years after 1870, we have 1920. We have the 19th Amendment, and women are finally given the right to vote. And then 51 years later, we have yet another expansion, and 18-year-olds are actually given the right to vote. This is on the heels of the Vietnam War. What we saw was that a number of 18, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds were being sent off to war, but a war that they had, for a country where they had no political influence. They couldn't vote. You could be sent to fight in a war, but you could not vote. And so we changed, and 18-year-olds were able to vote. Now, this is an expansion, obviously, of the right to vote, but there were also tremendous setbacks. So let's look back to 1870. And what we see after 1870, the conclusion of the Civil War, there's this 10-year period of Reconstruction when it's a really vibrant political process where people who were formerly enslaved were completely engaging in the political process at all levels of government. Tremendous moment. But then there was pushback from the white men. They basically devise a way to limit the ability of black men to participate, and later black women also to participate. We see things like the literacy test, which we just looked at, right? And basically the way the literacy test worked is somebody would come and register to vote, and if they were a person of color, the registrar of voters, who was generally a white person, would look at them and say, okay, take this test. And they would take the test. If they actually got the first 10 questions right, they would give them another 10. There were 68 in total. So they would basically keep going until the person didn't pass. A second way in which people were kept from voting was having to pay a poll tax. Basically, this was where you would have to go and pay this tax. You would need a receipt that says you had paid. So when you went to vote, you would have to show this receipt. The people who would be asked for those receipts were people of color. Generally, white people were not. A final thing that we see is the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause says, okay, even if you don't have any money to pay the poll tax, and even if you can't pass the literacy test, if your grandfather voted in 1867, then you were eligible to vote. If your grandfather voted in 1867, then you were eligible to vote. Now, if we take a look at this, who was eligible to vote in 1867? White men. White men. So chances are, if a black man came to register to vote, they would say, sorry, your grandfather wasn't able to, you can't vote. So this was yet another way that people were kept from voting. Now, each of these obstacles, the literacy test, the poll tax, and the grandfather clause, were struck down one by one. First was the grandfather clause, struck down in 1915 by the Supreme Court. The poll tax was then struck down by adding the 24th Amendment in 1964. And finally, the literacy test was eliminated with the Voting Rights Act in 1965. All right, so I want to take a few minutes and talk about the Voting Rights Act, page 193 and 99 in your textbook, if you want to look it up. The Voting Rights Act is a piece of legislation that says it is illegal for state and local governments to create and enforce rules that diminish racial and ethnic minority voting power. What it means is that the federal government is watching over what state and local governments do, making sure that they do not create laws, enforce laws that lessen the power of ethnic and racial minorities in terms of voting. The reason this was necessary, right? They had gotten rid of some of these obstacles, but in 1960, let me just show you a statistic. You see that 73% of eligible white people who were eligible to vote, were registered to vote. 73% were registered. 29% of black people who were eligible to vote, were registered. 29% of black people who were eligible to vote were registered. 73% of the whites, 29% of the blacks. So we needed some sort of federal legislation to deal with this, the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act actually did fix this. And what it does is it puts in place a system that we call pre-clearance. Pre-clearance. And so there are, and you can see from this map, that there are certain places in the United States that were designated as areas that warranted federal oversight. Okay. Some places it was the entire state, some places it was only part of the state. But there were 16 different locations where it was necessary for the federal government to look over. And what we use, this term is pre-clearance. clearance, to clear ahead of time, to look ahead of time before any of those states made any changes that might affect people's ability to vote. So the states, the national government was watching over these states and local communities. And basically the way this legislation was crafted, it had to periodically be reauthorized by Congress. In 2006, it was in fact reauthorized. George W. Bush was president, and it was reauthorized by Congress to last for 25 years. That should be 2031. What happens is, in 2013, there's a court case, right? A Supreme Court case, Shelby County versus Holder. And what Shelby County versus Holder says is that, wait a minute, that this notion of pre-clearance, of the federal government watching over states and local communities, is actually infringing on the state's sovereignty and the state's dignity. That elections are supposed to be controlled by the states, right? This is the reason we have so many different ways in which the primaries work. Elections are controlled by the states. They also made the claim in Shelby County v. Holder that things have changed, that the problems that we had in 1960, this incredible discrepancy, this has changed. And that what they said is, look, we have twice elected a black man to be president, 2 times. So how can we possibly say that black people are not being represented in the political system? So this was the argument that we see Shelby County, Alabama making to the federal government and the Supreme Court. Now what happens is basically the Supreme Court looked at this case and they decided in favor of Shelby County. They said, you know what, okay, you're basically right. And they said that the problem was, in fact, the statistical data that was used to determine which states, which of these 16 states were affected by preclearance was old. And so therefore they wiped out this whole idea of preclearance. The idea still exists, but there are no particular states or counties which are being watched over by the federal government. There's no actual clearance taking place. So the idea is that basically we need to pull back and let the states do what they're doing because the system has fixed itself. Okay, so this was the majority opinion. The minority opinion challenges this. The minority said, yeah, preclearance was working. It helped decrease discrimination, that this statistic was nowhere near as imbalanced as it was, but that doesn't mean you no longer. Oh, you gotta go.
Yeah.
All right, you guys, excuse me. I had to just stop. We're actually filming this. And it turned 7 o'clock. I don't know if you could hear the noise in the background. But I know every night at 7 o'clock we've been clapping, and I have my vuvuzela that I've been playing out the window to say thank you. And it's a very humble thing to be doing, but I know that I'm thanking all of you guys. So, carry on. Wow. Anyway, that was nothing compared to how loud I can do it. All right, back to the Voting Rights Act. So here's what happened. Basically, the Voting Rights Act, the teeth of this act were taken out when they decided that basically we would keep the Voting Rights Act, but there would be no particular places where the federal government would exercise oversight. That was the majority opinion. The minority opinion, in the voice of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, says this, that throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm. because you are no longer getting wet. It's like throwing away an umbrella in a rainstorm because you are no longer getting wet. What she's saying is that, yeah, it was working because we had this protection. That's why this number is no longer true, right? It's working because we had protections in place. Take away the protections, and we are seeing, little by little, it's not quite this bad, but the statistic, the divide, is happening all over again. So the question is, where are we now? Where are we now, going forward? The Republicans have their presidential candidate, Donald Trump. The Democrats seem to have their presidential candidate, Joe Biden. So, are we done? Is the whole primary season over? Do we just wait for the general election in November? A resounding no. We absolutely do not wait. The primary season is not over. And we still need to pay attention, and we still need to vote in the New York primary. The New York primary has in fact been postponed until June 23rd. So, what about this primary? Joe Biden, is most likely going to be the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. So what do we do now as voters? People will now begin to carefully study his record, examining anything and everything about this guy, to find out who he really is and what kind of president he will make. Some of us will also do the same thing when we consider voting for Donald Trump as the Republican candidate. Although with Donald Trump, we have evidence of what kind of president he will be. And for some people, they think, great, bring it on, let's keep going. And for others, they think, wait, we need to stop and we need a change. So when you look at the ballot, you will also see that a number of the other challengers, a number of the other people who had hoped to be either Democrat or Republican candidates for president are still on the ballot in New York. Now, that is partly because those people qualified to get on the ballot. They got the required number of signatures, they filed the required paperwork, and they got themselves on the ballot, and just dropping out of the race doesn't mean they were removed from the ballot, because the deadline was a long time ago for filing your campaign. They did it, the ballots are printed, right? So these people are still on the ballot. So, and particularly in the case of Bernie Sanders, who, as I said, just recently dropped out, some people are still considering voting for him in June in New York. Why would you do that if, in fact, he has no chance of actually being the Democratic candidate because of the way the delegate counts have worked out and because he, in fact, has dropped out of the race? Why would you vote for him? Well, it goes back to something that we talked about last time, and this idea of the platform, and the platform that the Democrats will stand on, right? That Bernie Sanders and his supporters would like to have some influence over the actual planks of this platform, right? They would like to have a say in what the Democrats are going to stand for in this electoral cycle. And so, yes, in fact, some people will continue to support Bernie Sanders in hopes of him having more delegates, more people at the table, right, at this convention, so that their voice in these discussions of the platform are louder. And there are a number of things that they're focusing on. A few in particular is they would like more extensive access to health care, right? That they want something beyond the Affordable Care Act, beyond Obamacare, right? So the Sanders delegates are pushing to expand access to health care farther than the Biden campaign has it right now. They would like a bolder plan in terms of climate change, right? They would love to see the Green New Deal adopted by the Biden campaign. I don't know if they'll go that far, but they're hoping to push the Biden people to adopt a stronger platform plank on climate change. And finally, And probably most importantly, what they are really pushing for is some policies that will address economic inequality. This has really been the bedrock of the Bernie Sanders campaign, this idea of economic inequality and how do we level this out a little bit. And so they are strong, they're pushing strong to try to get the Biden campaign to adopt a plank that is dealing with economic inequality. So this is what we see in terms of the presidential race coming up. But the New York primary is not just about the presidential race. We're also looking at something called down ballot. We're looking at down ballot races. And if you think about it, the president is usually on the top of the ballot. Then you have the senators, and then you have representatives. Right? So if you picture the ballot when you're voting, this is generally the way it goes. Well, it turns out that our senators are not actually, either one of them, our senators are not actually up for re-election, so they're kind of out of the picture. But every single one of our representatives is in fact up for re-election. The term for a representative is 2 years, right? And so this is the year. Now, for example, in New York, we have people like Grace Ming, Yvette Clarke, Jerry Nadler, Carolyn Maloney, Elliot Engel. These people are all facing primary challenges. Jose Serrano is retiring, right? So there's a bunch of people who would like his seat. So we see that there are a lot of important races that are going to happen in the end of June, places where decisions need to be made to see who in fact will be the candidate for the Democrats in these particular seats. Now, the question is, are any of those your representative? Grace Ming, Yvette Clarke, Jerry Nadler, Carolyn Maloney, Elliot Engel, Jose Serrano. Are any of those your representative? My guess is that most of you are saying, I have no idea. All right, so I can help you. How do you know if one of those is your representative? We're going to look at something called Ballotpedia, okay? And if you look at the way this website is laid out, and you can go on this website either on your phone or on your own computer, basically what you do is you put in an address, right? You put in an address. I usually use the address of BMCC, 199 Chambers Street, but you can put in your home address, and then you click, and you'll see that you check the June 23rd election, right, which is the primary election in New York that's coming up. And what you'll see is what the ballot will look like for your election district, okay? And you'll see first all the candidates who qualified to be president. As I said, most have dropped out except Biden. Scrolling down, you'll see that in this district, which is the 10th congressional district, yours may be different depending where you live, you'll see that Jerry Nadler is the incumbent. That means he's the person who currently holds the position and he's running for re-election. But then he has a number of challengers. And if you are interested, you can click on Jerry Nadler or any one of his challengers and figure out who they are, see if you like them. So just to be clear, that the primary in June is absolutely not just about the president, okay? Biden may be already decided and Trump may be already decided, but there is a lot of other down ballot stuff that is really important. If you live in Queens, the borough president is up for grabs. So this is a really important time, right? And we'll talk in our next session about Congress, because really the president is an important part of the system, but only one part of the system. The other thing that I want to think about quickly is this idea of access, right? A lot of what we've been talking about is who's able to vote and who's not. And how do we make sure that all of our voices can be heard? How do we make sure that all of our voices can be heard, that our votes are counted, right? And this is a huge concern. It has been since the beginning of the country. It still is. Now, we no longer have literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clause. These have all been put to rest, but there are many, many other obstacles which make it difficult, if not impossible, for some people to vote. People who should be eligible, people who are 18 years old and citizens, right? Some states require identification, which not all people have. Some states require that you register in advance, which can create incredible difficulties, burdens, especially for young people who tend to be moving much more often. Some states require a person to vote in a single day at a certain time, limited hours, in a very particular place, which is incredibly difficult if somebody goes to school full-time, works full-time, takes care of their kids. How do they do this, right? These are just a few of the ways in which participation is limited, obstacles to voting. Now, one issue that has come up recently as we begin to struggle with this coronavirus and the new situation we have is this idea of voting by mail. Voting by mail is basically using an absentee ballot. An absentee ballot. Now you see here that this is an example of an absentee ballot. And you see at the very top, it's basically asking you, why do you want an absentee ballot? You have to make some sort of an excuse. You have to explain why it is you're not going to show up and vote in person. Okay, this has changed. This has changed. It used to be set up that you could request an absentee ballot if, in fact, you had a good excuse, and then you would fill out this piece of paper and you would mail it back in, or you would drop it off to the Board of Elections sometime before the deadline. Just the other day, New York's Governor Cuomo made an executive order. He announced that due to the coronavirus pandemic, that any voter, any eligible voter can request an absentee ballot, right? That we can all claim that we have an illness. So what happens is basically we need to request those ballots, they will be mailed to us, and then we can mail them back. Now you still can vote in person, and there is in fact early voting, but the idea is basically to try to encourage more people to participate. So, question is this: what do you think about voting? What do you think about voting? Do you think it matters if you vote? Do you think that all those men and women who struggled, sometimes even gave their lives so that we could vote, do you think that was worth it? Do you think it matters if you vote? I want you to think about this. I want you to talk to people around you, find out what they think about it. And then I want you to do a little bit of writing about it. Thank you.